Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
"17 men and 1 woman have been convicted of sexual exploitation and drugs offences in Newcastle. Most of the men were from Pakistani, Indian or Bangladeshi backgrounds. Their youngest victim was just 14. The convictions are the result of Operation Sanctuary. Controversially, Northumbria Police paid £10,000 to a convicted child rapist for information that helped to expose this network of abuse. Our correspondent Fiona Trott has been following this case.
Guilty of causing girls and women serious harm. Caught as part of Operation Sanctuary, one of the biggest sexual exploitation investigations in the north of England. Almost 100 perpetrators have already been convicted. One 17-year-old was raped at a party session organised by local men. It's a familiar story.
I woke up in the morning, the wardrobe was pushed up against the door.
Her police interview was played to the court. To protect her identity, we've asked actors to read what was said.
He'd had sex with us while I was asleep. Still now, I'm a bit confused about it.
How do you feel when he told you he'd done that to you?
Dirty, confused.
So how many sessions would you say you've been to?
About 60.
It's in houses like these where the sessions took place.
SIM cards, drugs, computers, cash.
Victims were given drink and drugs and were unable to defend themselves against sexual abuse. But in 2013, 2 of them came forward. One had been trafficked from a children's home, the other had learning difficulties. It started a long and complex investigation. Controversially, officers recruited a convicted child rapist as an informant. He was paid around £10,000.
It's not an easy decision, and I'm not going to sit here and suggest for one moment it was. It's a decision that we've had to wrestle with ourselves. But I can categorically state, sitting here today, that there are dangerous men behind bars now and vulnerable people protected that would not have been the case had we not used that informant.
What confounds us and beggars belief, frankly, is the decision to cross this child protection line, really, about employing a child rapist.
Most of the perpetrators were from Pakistani, Indian or Bangladeshi backgrounds.
I mean, some of these men, they're stuck in their ways.
This city councillor says leaders from all faiths could re-educate some local men to stop similar exploitation in the future.
People should not be telling the Asian community how to live their lives or what to do. And it's quite important. It's just like saying to the white community that we should be talking about what Jimmy Savile did. We should not do that. However, there's a huge opportunity to talk about these issues on a regular basis of rights of women, and I think it's important to use religion, particularly Islam, to educate some of these people.
The chief executive of Newcastle City Council says a serious case review is being carried out, but it's not the only authority with problems of this kind.
We do not believe that what we have uncovered in Newcastle is unique. Indeed, there has been evidence of similar offending in many other towns and cities. We believe that any area that says it does not have a problem is simply not looking for it.
It's been a long and traumatic journey for the victims in these cases, but their evidence has helped jail 4 perpetrators. The rest are due to be sentenced next month. Fiona Trott, BBC News, Newcastle.
And our home editor Mark Easton is with me here. Mark, I think I know what people will be thinking. Shock at paying a criminal for information.
The police paying informants for information is certainly controversial, but of course there's nothing new or out of the ordinary of it. In the last 5 years, police in England and Wales have paid something like £20 million to convicted felons in return for information that might produce prosecutions or might in fact prevent crime. But in this case, I think there was another question too. That was the fact that this was a convicted rapist who was put in proximity with young women who were being groomed for sex. And I think many people might feel more uneasy about that. I think it is also perhaps indicative of a determination by the police, by the authorities, to show that they will do what it takes to get results in these really very difficult cases. Now, there have been dozens of grooming gang cases, and the authorities have been under pressure to do more because of suggestions that they'd not done enough because they were worried about a backlash of racism. Now, police officers are routinely briefed on how to spot this kind of abuse, who the victims are, where it's likely to take place, types of grooming behaviour. Prosecutors are now advised to be careful that victims may sometimes not even realise they are victims, that they are being so controlled by their abusers. So for some people, I think that these are hard cases to prosecute, and perhaps what we're seeing today is a sign that the authorities are getting convictions because they're better at identifying and prosecuting these cases.
Mark, thank you very much.
Now, Northumbria Police have defended using a convicted child rapist in an investigation into child sexual abuse in Newcastle. Over the course of 4 trials, 17 men and 1 woman were convicted of offences including rape, supplying drugs and inciting prostitution. Today, the police insisted that the information supplied by their informant prevented other girls from becoming victims, but they admitted they couldn't be certain he hadn't attended the parties where abuse took place. Fatima Manji reports.
These are the faces of 17 men and 1 woman convicted of crimes ranging from rape, kidnapping and trafficking. After 4 trials over 2 years, today it can be revealed they were responsible for exploiting underage and vulnerable girls in Newcastle. Between 2011 and 14, the mainly teenage girls were befriended by their abusers, lured to parties known as sessions and plied with alcohol, cocaine and methadone. 20 victims gave evidence in court, explaining how they'd wake up to find themselves having been drugged and sexually assaulted. Just as in previous cases, in Rochdale and Rotherham, the victims believed they were in relationships with these older men, who would then pass them around the network for sex.
It is a huge task that we are faced with. To date, Operation Sanctuary has been the most complex investigation in this force's history, and it has not stopped.
Operation Sanctuary is Northumbria Police's broader inquiry into abuse of vulnerable girls by mostly Asian men. So far, more than 200 victims have been identified. But during the course of this trial, it emerged that police had paid a convicted child rapist £10,000 to act as an informant. And that controversial decision has been heavily criticised.
He was cut loose and was sent out there into these communities to network with these known or these potential offenders, and potentially to have contact with vulnerable children and young people as well. And the police don't know whether he was or not, or whether in fact he was committing any sexual offences against these children.
The judge found police procedures had been properly followed, and Northumbria Police say the informant, known as XY, wasn't deployed to attend these parties. But they cannot guarantee he didn't go anyway.
We have to step into a murky, a dangerous and a shadowy world, and the people who are going to provide us with that information that will protect victims, that will stop other women and girls becoming victims of this abuse. It's not the postmaster or the district nurse or some other person in a position of authority. They are the very people who themselves may well have committed these vile acts. It's a decision that we've had to wrestle with ourselves. But I can categorically state, sitting here today, that there are dangerous men behind bars now and vulnerable people protected that would not have been the case had we not used that informant.
The investigation in Newcastle remains ongoing. And while some of the offenders were brought to justice today, once again questions are being asked. Could more have been done to protect vulnerable girls from traumatic and systematic sexual abuse?
Fatima Manji reporting there. Newcastle now joins a growing roll call of English towns and cities where teenage girls were preyed on and abused by gangs of men. They include Rochdale, Oxford, Aylesbury, Bristol, Peterborough and Rotherham. Well, one of the girls who was abused there is Sammy Woodhouse, who's now waived her anonymity, and she joins me live now. Sammy Woodhouse, when you heard what had happened in Newcastle, what was your first thought?
Well, when I heard that there was a trial, of course, I'm always sad to hear that, you know, the people are being affected by this, but I think it's great to hear that victims are coming forward, you know, they're speaking out and they're being able to get justice. What I'm absolutely still lost for words at which is not many things in life that shock me, is you know, with the informer that he's being paid to go in there and be around vulnerable people. It's just absolutely shocking, and I get the impression what the only thing that's being looked at is the end result. And of course, it's not always about that end result. It's about keeping people safe. You know, the victims' of families, getting them support, and I think I think a line's been crossed.
Well, that's very interesting to hear you say that. I mean, the police have had quite a lot of criticism for paying a convicted child rapist today, but they've defended that, and, you know, they have got the conviction of 17 men and 1 woman. Does that make any difference in the way you view that?
I understand that, you know, the police have got a lot of pressure on them, and, you know, of course, their information does come from criminals. That's not, for me, what the point is. The point is that he's being placed back in there with vulnerable people, and vulnerable people, you know, could have been hurt. You know, why not use a police officer and, you know, send him in there and, you know, just to make people a little bit more safer. I just think it's not being thoughtful. It's not being, you know, aimed towards the victim's best interests. And me personally, you know, because of course I can't speak on their behalf, but if I was in that circumstance, I wouldn't like it one little bit. It's great to see him behind bars, but I think there could have been other ways to do that.
What impact do you think that might have on the Newcastle survivors?
Well, the first thing I would have asked is, you know, am I not good enough to be classed as a good witness as evidence? Now, you know, as a witness, that is your strongest evidence. It's the victim. Why not, you know, build them up, give them the support, you know, get them strong enough to be that credible witness in court? Why go to these, you know, these extreme lengths?
And of course, that has always traditionally been an issue. Do you think that is still an issue now, that confidence in victims and survivors?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's still a lot of victim blaming going on. I think people, you know, they don't give us enough credit for, you know, for what we've been through. You know, we're kind of looked at as we're very damaged, we're weak, we're vulnerable. Well, actually, we're very strong and brave people, and, you know, it's one thing to get through that, it's one thing to get through the investigation and to go into court, and we're just not given enough credit.
I mean, when you read what has happened in the Newcastle grooming cases, there are appalling similarities, mostly Asian men plying girls with alcohol. There are awful similarities with what happened to you. What thoughts does that raise?
There is, and, you know, unfortunately I've heard this story so many times. It's, you know, not just happening in Rotherham, Rochdale, Newcastle. It's absolutely everywhere. It's in home streets, online. I think a lot needs to be done. I think it's been going on for generations and generations. It's just only now that we're starting to talk about it and kind of bringing it to the forefront.
So what more needs to be done in your view?
Well, we need to put a lot more in for prevention. I think the support, you know, that needs to be a lot better. We're only getting certain amounts of support. I don't think authorities are working together. We forget that this happens to boys as well. People think it only happens to girls, and I think now we've heard of what grooming is, but we still don't understand it. And to be able to tackle this properly, we have to be able to understand it. I think that the government needs to be doing more. I think, you know, police forces were understaffed. We need to be throwing everything at this, and at the moment we're still not.
What toll did what you went through take, and still takes to this day, on you?
I feel like I've been given a life sentence. Now I'm a very strong person, and I always say that, you know, there is life after abuse, but I had eating disorders, mental health issues, I was suicidal, and of course it's not just me that were affected by that, my children, you know, my family, my parents. I feel like I've been given that life sentence, and it's only been kind of in the last year or so, because I've been given that proper support, that I've started to be able to change my life around and kind of move forward into my next chapter.
And just finally, I mean, that is really good to hear that you are able to move on after what happened to you. But what advice do you give now to the Newcastle survivors who are struggling with what's happened to them?
I would say to them, you know, you don't just have to survive this, you can thrive from it, to not let the people ruin any more of your life, to, and as well, it's important that they're given that correct support to do that. And, you know, I think we need to start and empower the survivors to make them able to move forward.
Sammy Woodhouse, thank you so much for joining us and having the courage to speak out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by Jim Gamble, a former police officer and the former chief executive of the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre. Jim Gamble, first of all, would you pay a convicted child rapist to spy on this kind of grooming network?
The answer to that is no. I can't imagine circumstances. And I have been a head of counter-terrorism in Ireland, Deputy Director General of the National Crime Squad dealing with serious and organised crime, so responsible for authorising the tasking and use of informants. But I cannot imagine circumstances where the legality, necessity and proportionality could be met to carry out what is in essence an extremely lawfully audacious tactic. But then the devil of this will be in the detail, and the Chief Constable and the senior officers within Northumbria will have had more access to more detail. But no, I can't imagine circumstances where I would have authorised this.
I mean, the police have been quite clear that, you know, none of the girls have criticised their work. And, you know, at the end of the day, they've managed to convict 17 men and 1 woman. They say they've thrown the kitchen sink at it, employed every technique, covert and overt.
And if you want to adopt the view that the end justifies the means, you can see that the police are giving evidence of that with regards to the number of victims who have now survived this abuse and the number of predators who've been captured. But actually, if we're going to use that, then we're entitled to ask questions like, you know, how much evidence did the informant provide in court to lead to these convictions? I'm not aware that the informant actually gave evidence. And where the informant was used, what level of control was there? Because if you have an informant, and I've worked with many, they have a tendency to use the authority that they have, the relationship with the police they have, as an umbrella. And that boosts their confidence. So when they're engaging in those criminal acts or in the periphery of them, they think, well, I can go a little bit further because I'm not going to be held to account. So there needs to be a fundamentally independent, child-centred review of this, not by the Office of Surveillance Commissioners, not by the ICPC, because they will simply look at process and procedure. We need to look at safeguarding. Did children come first? Were those interventions made as early as was humanly possible? Or did the overriding process of the criminal justice system, the need for longer surveillance, come first? Because in my experience, that does happen, and it happens too often. So yes, let's celebrate the rescue of these young survivors, but let's not forget about the survivor of the informant's abuse, who perhaps is hearing this for the first time, and I hope it's not for the first time, on the news tonight. And let's spare a thought for that individual.
Well, just briefly, you might have heard Sammy Woodhouse, the Rotherham survivor, saying how appalled she was by this decision to pay a convicted rapist. Do you think there is still an issue, as she said, that survivors are not taken seriously enough by the courts?
Of course there's an issue. I think we need to educate and empower survivors. The more that come forward, the better. We've got to reassure them that they will be treated credibly, that their evidence, their allegations will be taken so seriously that that will inspire the investigation and the search for evidence. It cannot just be about a single informant. And on the basis of the scale of this investigation, I do not believe that this single informant can be responsible for everything good that comes from it. So we do need to strip away the surface and to have a close look from a child's perspective, from a survivor's perspective, to make sure that this informant did not use the protection that he had from the police to carry out or commit additional offences. We need to learn lessons so that we can get better at this in the future.
Yeah. Jim Gamble, thank you very much for joining us.
Another 18 child abusers tonight face long prison sentences. But given the lethargy in Rotherham and the eventual breakthrough in Rochdale, it is not surprising. The Chief Constable of Northumbria said his force had thrown the kitchen sink at the Newcastle case with no fear or favour to political correctness. He justified the payment of £10,000 to an informer, a convicted child abuser, because it helped secure those verdicts. But called the 100 offences, including rape, human trafficking, inciting prostitution and supplying drugs, just examples of the challenges of our generation.
These 17 men and 1 woman are part of one of the biggest grooming rings ever uncovered in Britain. They targeted troubled teenage girls in Newcastle, abused them and passed them around.
This is truly awful. Abusing young people, children and people who have inherent vulnerabilities is about as bad as it gets.
The grooming started when girls were lured in with gifts and the kind of attention they were not used to. Then they were trafficked from location to location around the city, where other men in this ring were waiting. It was organised abuse, and it went on for 4 years. These high flats were one of the locations used by the Newcastle grooming ring for what became known as sessions. These sessions were parties for the abusers. They provided the drugs and alcohol. The girls brought here were expected to provide sexual services in return. The girls say they'd pass out at these sessions. The court heard one of them say, "Men had sex with me when I was asleep." Another girl said these sessions were like a relay race, one man after another. None of them had her consent. It has now emerged, though, that police investigating this grooming ring paid a known child abuser £10,000 to act as an informant, a tactic already condemned by the NSPCC.
This is the world that we have to step into, and without stepping into it, we simply would not have been able to gather some of the intelligence and information that we did, and vulnerable people would have been victims, and dangerous men would not be in prison were it not for the information that we gathered.
Many of the victims abused by this ring were also known to social services. One was in care. It was, however, social workers here who first alerted police.
What's happened in Newcastle isn't unique. It's happening in lots of places across the country. And if you're not finding it, then you're not looking hard enough, in my experience.
Like Rochdale, Rotherham and Aylesbury, this grooming ring is predominantly men of Asian descent. The Asian community in Newcastle has released an open letter urging people not to blame an entire culture, but the man who wrote that letter hopes difficult questions will now be asked.
These men have preyed on the most vulnerable, but they have preyed on white women. And there could be, and I think this discussion we need to have, there could be that these men have specifically targeted white women, and we can't deny that fact.
These 18 convictions have broken yet another grooming ring. But the scars the victims bear have not gone away, and the scale of what's happened here will also raise concerns about whether police are now just scratching the surface. Peter Smith, News at 10, Newcastle.
A short time ago I spoke to Nazir Afzal, the former senior Crown prosecutor for the North West. It was he who finally brought charges against the Rochdale sexual grooming gang in 2012. And I began by asking him if he feels that there's been progress now in how these cases are handled since Rochdale.
From what I know about the case, some of the same errors were made in the early stages. Officers didn't believe some of these victims. Some of the perpetrators were given warnings rather than being investigated. So some of the same mistakes were made, undoubtedly. But obviously we've learned from much of what happened in 2011, 2012 with the Rochdale case. And we've put things in place now that mean that there are specialist officers and specialist support teams. And the victims, I hope, will feel that justice has been delivered.
When you say there are those support teams in place, you might agree that that's no bad thing. I think it was the Chief Executive of Newcastle City Council who said to authorities generally, if you haven't found this form of abuse, you are not looking for it.
He's right, or she's right. I remember in 2012, after Rochdale, telling people that this is more prevalent than you think it is. It's not historical, it's happening right now, and it's happening all over the country. We've really opened up, we just turned over the stone. We've turned over the stone, and we found all of this happening. And I suspect if everybody turned over the stone, they would find it pretty much in every region of this country.
And in your view, then, is everybody now doing what they should be doing? Prosecutors, police, investigators, social services, or is it a work in progress?
Very much a work in progress. Victims groups still contact me, even though I'm no longer in the prosecution service, to complain about the service they're receiving. So we can't get complacent. We're in a much better place now than we ever were. We're prosecuting and investigating more of these types of offending in our history. But at the same time, I have no doubt whatsoever that there are offenses happening as we speak in some part of this country.
Finally, as a former public prosecutor, do you have any qualms about the payment of £10,000 to a convicted child abuser to help the police with their inquiries?
I share the concerns that Jim Gamble and the NSPCC have. I think this was a line I wouldn't have crossed. To put it bluntly, it's not the money that's the issue, it's the fact that you can't control what a sex offender does with other sex offenders. That's my experience. You know, very often they carry on offending for 30, 40, 50 years. They don't just stop because they're being convicted. And putting a child sex abuser with other child sex abusers in places where you can't manage the risk is too dangerous for my mind.
even if that was the only way of guaranteeing the convictions?
Well, I don't accept that. I mean, I've dealt with cases involving using undercover officers, using surveillance, using technology. There are other ways of getting the evidence. You don't have to put children at risk, as was likely to have happened in this case.
Nazir Afzal, the former senior Crown prosecutor for the North West, talking to me a little earlier. Angus Walker joins me now live in the studio. He's praising there the prosecutors, but he says a work in progress, just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, yeah, and that operation is going on. This case gives us another glimpse into a very dark world of abuse, of predators who see young women as prey, but it also reflects a shift in attitudes. This shows the police putting a lot more determination into getting convictions. The Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the prosecutors, all working hard now. A shift since Savile, since Rochdale, not to make the same mistakes, to believe victims. But the more the police detect, the more convictions we see, the more difficult the questions get for society. You look at the latest crime statistics, rape up 22%. Sexual assaults up 20%. 9% of women 16 to 19 victims of sexual offences. That age group, the most likely to be a victim. If you're walking to work tomorrow, you're walking down the street, 1 in 5 women will have been a victim of some sort of sexual offence since they were 16. So look around you tomorrow. So this court case may have ended, but you get the sense we're at the beginning of more dark discoveries. There will be more cases like this, and that's why you heard the Chief Constable say, this is the challenge of our generation.
Angus Walker, thank you.
If you